Grüß, willkommen in einem einen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 35 of my Game Design History and Theory series of videos. In this video I'll be conducting an analysis of the tempo of combat. In simple terms, what kind of advance would you expect based on your forces and the enemy forces? Factors such as terrain and the direction of attack is catered for as well. This article, or this video, is based on Strategy and Tactics article in issue 46, which is in turn based on the US Army analysis printed in their FM 105-5 manual titled Maneuver Control. My objective is to make sense of the data contained in the US Army document. Up to the point of rediscovering this article, my conclusions concerning advance rates were based on a British Army analysis conducting a prepared attack against a prepared defence during 1943 in Italy. This was primarily infantry based and basically concluded that an average attack at 3 to 1 odds could be expected to advance up to 500 metres in a 4 to 8 hour period. Based on no specific data, I assumed this would be doubled if the terrain was clear. The impact of tanks in this is interesting. While the Germans did use breakthrough tactics with their tanks, specifically at Kursk, in most cases, if the initial tank rush failed, it was the infantry's job to break the line and get the tanks through, obviously with assistance from armoured fighting vehicles, specifically assault guns. Thus, I concluded the rate of advance of fully mechanised forces would not be much greater until at least the breakthrough occurred. This table from the US Army FM 105-5 manual describes the effect of the enemy's presence to a formation's rate of advance. It must be pointed out these are an average rate of advance and variability will exist, such as if opposing Japanese troops or Soviet infantry at Stalingrad, or if your troops possessed unusual aggressiveness. An interesting note is the initial assault is assumed to be infantry, which does match the British Army experience, or example. Examples in Sinai seem to indicate that unsupported tanks attempting to break through prepared infantry lines will have a very hard time. This even occurred when Germany attacked Poland in 1939 and drove through Belgium in 1940. There are examples of a tank rush breaking through, but it seems to be the exception rather than the rule, although this did occur in the Golan Heights. Of course, unprepared enemy infantry would be an easy target for armour on the move. At distances of 5,000 metres or greater from an enemy position, there is no significant effect on movement. Your formation could move as rapidly as able, although enemy indirect fire may have an effect, as would enemy air attacks. In most cases, troops could move in some form of travel mode at this distance, although that may not be the case in some circumstances. Regardless, it's unlikely troops would adopt a travel mode at distances less than 5,000 metres from a known enemy position, unless forced. Otherwise, they would represent a juicy target for enemy units. At distances between 5,000 metres and 1,000 metres from known enemy, troops would slow down. The rate is the same as if fighting through enemy at 5 to 1 odds. As an example, this is between 1100 and 3300 metres per hour in clear terrain. Even at 3300 metres per hour, this is a fraction of the rate of movement possible when mounted in a tracked vehicle, which could be 10 times this value in clear terrain. We will be covering the movement rates later, but this does represent a major slowing effect. We will later also discover that these two values are more affected by proximity to the enemy rather than the attacking troop type. At distances up to 1,000 metres to the assault line, the distances that a unit can travel is based on the force ratio. Thus, at 3 to 1, you would expect to advance at 1,100 metres per hour in clear terrain. Assuming good quality troops, you would use the higher value, but this means it would take 2 hours to cross 1,000 metres. One point to note here, clear terrain provides special benefits to the attacker, effectively doubling their ability to attack or advance. Thus, using the US manual, my example would show an advance of 3,300 metres per hour. But if the terrain was median, basically difficult terrain, the rate of advance would be only 750 metres per hour. Terrain has a major impact on the advance rate of attacking infantry, or any forces actually. This row represents the advance occurring during actual combat, although it's possible losses would have occurred getting to the assault line itself, so some combat may have occurred beforehand. The rate of advance is dependent on the force-strength ratio, taking into account any losses getting to the position, or this position, and terrain of course. The lower rate of our range would be used, so at 3 to 1 the rate of advance is about 500 metres per hour if clear, 400 metres per hour if difficult, and 250 metres per hour if closed terrain, built up basically, or heavy woods. I'm uncertain how this US manual applies to my British example, as it would take an hour to advance 550 metres, while the British example indicated this is the advance expected in an entire day. If we assume the British would bring troops up to the assault line, which would take 2 hours, and then attack the enemy in close terrain, as the British were attacking the Italian forces over a river, so you would class it as, let's say, the worst possible terrain, we would arrive at the value of 4 hours, which seems reasonable. I suspect the terrain in Italy was unusual and that my personal modifiers of doubling those distances in most cases was the correct call. I must admit, while reading the US manual, I'm uncertain exactly what the assault line means. It could be the point from which the assault begins, or it could be the enemy's defensive line. I suspect it's an average of both, as in modern warfare the men did not normally meet face to face, but fought over a range of 250 to 500 metres, depending of course on the terrain. An infantry assault line to objective movement clearly represents displacing defending enemy forces. What distance this represents is variable, but as troops can rarely fight effectively for more than 8 hours, this distance depends on the terrain and force ratio. If it takes 4 hours to reach the assault line, then an objective should be within 4 hours of an assault line. It's also possible an attack will represent several waves, with the rear wave taking the place of the front wave when it's exhausted. But this does not give you the benefit that you may think. Remember, it takes time to cover ground when the enemy is close by, so the rear line may have been in motion as long as the front line. I also feel this is factored into these values, as the values provided are for brigade to division size formation. It's assumed the attackers will advance in waves and that the rate of advance would be factored into this. This chart shows you the expected advance in metres per hour against enemy resistance based on force ratio and terrain. For example, if the attacker has a 3 to 1 force ratio advantage against enemy defenders in medium terrain, the expected rate of advance is 750 metres per hour. The first point to clarify is what is meant by force ratio. The original document states this is the relative firepower, or the ability of the formation to project metal and explosive. The whole aspect of determining firepower values warrants a video in its own right, but without going into detail, we can calculate this by determining how much metal can be projected in a 60-second period with modifiers for high explosive armour and armour penetration weapons. It does not represent numbers of men, tanks or vehicle, it's a firepower ratio. Moving down the definition path, open terrain is defined as open, flat, slightly rolling terrain. Open would be unusually open and flat terrain, such as desert, steppe or plains. It would be encountered in the desert and in possibly southern Russia. Medium terrain is defined as rolling, lightly covered with trees, moderately open, moderately closed. Medium, by its name, represents the most common terrain. This is the typical terrain encountered in Europe and parts of Russia, and is the type of terrain which most wargamers would consider as clear terrain. Closed terrain is defined as rough, heavily wooded, mountainous terrain. Closed would be cluttered or difficult terrain, including large amounts of woods, rivers or rough terrain. It could even represent built-up areas, although a built-up area would be both closed and fortified, so would be rather different from woods. This is probably the terrain the British faced in Italy in my example, and which was used in their study of expected advances against opposition, which is used in my very earlier videos. The next factor to consider are the defensive posture and the direction of attack. We can see 3 postures and 2 directions of attack, which is cross-referenced by the firepower ratio. The result is the final ratio, which is then used to determine the rate of advance. In this case, our 3 to 1 attack example would become 2 to 1 if the defenders were organised and a frontal attack conducted. This reduces our rate of advance from 300 metres to 200 metres per hour in closed terrain if foot. This now aligns with the 1943 British study. In this case, it would take 4 hours to cross to the assault line and a further 2 hours to advance to its objective, achieving an advance of 500 metres in a day of fighting. A defence posture of in open does not relate to the terrain, but simply the enemy was probably in motion and thus not taking any form of cover. In simple terms, the enemy is not taking cover. A defence posture of hasty defence means the enemy was taking cover but had not prepared any defensive positions. The troops simply went for any available natural cover and took cover in it. The more terrain available, the more effective this is. A defensive posture of organised defence would mean two things. Some preparation was made to increase the cover of troops, and the troops were organised in an optimal manner for defence. Foxholes, movement of foliage and other basic preparation would have been assumed. I'm uncertain if this means extensive fortification was prepared. I suspect not. It's highly likely none of these values are designed to represent attacking enemy troops in fortifications or even in built-up areas. If the direction of attack was front, this means the attacker is facing the enemy front. It's always assumed the attacker front is facing the enemy, otherwise how could they attack? Flank is self-explanatory. The enemy flank is being attacked, and unless the enemy are in prepared defences, it would severely be affected, or they would be affected. I would also assume this would include attacking the enemy rear, although there may have been an additional serious morale effect of such an action. One area which seems unclear is what happens when the modified force ratio is greater than 5:1, such as would occur in a flank attack. Based on my reading, the rate of advance does not change. I'm uncertain why this is the case. Perhaps the casualties would be the main difference, and even if the enemy routs, the attackers would not wish to advance more than a certain rate for basically safety and caution reasons. When an attacker with a force ratio of 1:1 attacks enemy in the open, the modified force ratio becomes 2:1. The explanation provided is these values are designed for brigade and divisional level conflicts, which mean an attacker can always achieve a local superiority even if its overall firepower is no greater than the defender. One point is heavily emphasised: if you do not achieve a final force ratio of at least 1:1, you cannot attack. This is a typical example of an attack based on my basic scenario, of which I've played many times with different rules. In this case, our advance, assuming from the attacker's player edge to a new position 1,000 metres behind the defender's line, takes 6.5 hours. Game hours, obviously. This does align quite well with games I've been using concerning rules such as Corps Commander, LWRS, and a number of my own rules based on Corps Commander. My games all cover an entire day of 12 hours, and I typically find once I've broken through the enemy line, I roll up the enemy line and drive to the enemy player edge, where I meet the defender's counterattack forces. My breakthrough normally occurs after 6 to 7 hours, game hours, or either side of the midpoint of the day. This aligns surprisingly well with the calculated value of 6.5 hours that I've just done. I'll have to admit I'm impressed with the US Army's FM 105-5 manual titled Manoeuvre Control. While not that applicable to squad scale rules, where the formations consist of a battalion per side and the period covered is often only a few hours at the most, when I compare these with rules which allow for play which cover at least 6 to 8 hours, I see a very strong alignment. My earlier used advance rate, based on the British experience in 1943 in Italy, are correct but depict an unusual situation. I was forced to double these values, which bring me to an advance rate similar to those depicted in the US Army manual. I will use these values to create other scenarios which involve more difficult terrain or different force mix ratios. And so this concludes episode 38 of my video on micro armour game system design, in which case I've done an analysis of the tempo of battle using US Army manuals and British experience in Italy in 1943. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.